You know, the most dangerous lies aren't the ones we tell other people. They aren't the fabrications we spin to get out of a speeding ticket or the little omissions we make to avoid hurting a spouse's feelings. The most dangerous lies, the ones that will absolutely destroy your life from the inside out, are the lies we tell ourselves. And I have sat across from thousands of people in this industry, thousands of broken souls looking for a lifeline, but I have never met anyone quite as committed to his own deception as a man named Mark. When I looked at the briefing dossier for this case, the first thing that jumped out at me wasn't the screaming matches or the accusations of infidelity or the financial ruin, which are the usual suspects in my line of work. It was the silence. It was the absolute, eerie precision with which Mark had dismantled his wife's reality, all while maintaining the exterior of a perfect, doting husband. He didn't come to my show to save his marriage. He came to my show to have me, Doctor. Phil McGraw, validate him. He wanted a co-signer on his version of the truth. He wanted me to look at his wife, Sarah, and tell her that she was the problem, that she was crazy, and that she should be grateful to be married to a man as patient and logical as him. That is a dangerous game to play. When you invite me into your life, you have to understand that I don't care about your version of the truth. I care about the objective reality. I care about what is actually happening when the doors are closed and the cameras aren't rolling. And what I saw with Mark and Sarah was a tragedy in slow motion. When I walked into the green room before the taping, I usually like to get a read on the energy. Usually, you feel tension. You feel heat. You can feel the anger radiating off people like waves off hot asphalt. But with them, it was cold. It was clinically cold. Mark was sitting there in a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, reading a business journal, looking as relaxed as if he were waiting for a haircut. Sarah was sitting in the corner, curled up in a chair that looked too big for her, staring at the floor. She looked like she was trying to disappear. She looked like a woman who had been told for 10 years that her feelings didn't matter, that her perceptions were wrong, and that her very existence was an inconvenience to the grand plan of Mark's life. I walked up to Mark and introduced myself, and he stood up, gave me a firm handshake, looked me right in the eye, and said, "Dr. Phil, I'm glad we're finally doing this." I just want to get my wife the help she needs. It was smooth. It was practiced. It was the kind of statement that sounds benevolent on the surface, but is actually a guided missile designed to destroy the other person's credibility before they even open their mouth. He was positioning himself as the caretaker and her as the patient. He was setting the stage. And I thought to myself, all right, buddy, you think you're the director of this play. You think you've got the script all written out, but you're about to find out that life doesn't work that way, and neither do I. We got out on stage, and the audience was polite, but I could feel them shifting in their seats. They didn't know who to root for yet. Mark presented well. He was articulate. He was handsome in a corporate sort of way, and he spoke with this calm, measured cadence that made him sound incredibly reasonable. He started explaining their dynamic. He told me that Sarah was emotional, erratic, and incapable of managing the basic logistics of their household. He brought charts. I am not kidding you. He actually brought a folder of spreadsheets to a relationship intervention to prove how much money Sarah had wasted over the last 5 years. He was treating his marriage like a failing subsidiary of a holding company. He looked at me and said, "Dr. Phil, I deal in facts. Facts are the only thing that matters. If the numbers don't add up, I can't just pretend they do to spare her feelings." Sarah, on the other hand, could barely get a sentence out without crying. And every time she cried, Mark would look at the audience, then look at me, and give this little shrug, as if to say, "See, this is what I have to deal with." But here is the thing about human behavior. We leak the truth. We can't help it. While Mark was presenting his PowerPoint presentation on why his wife was a failure, I was watching his eyes. I was watching the way he physically recoiled when she tried to touch his arm. I was watching the way he interrupted her, not with shouting, but with this soft, condescending correction. She would say, "I feel lonely," and he would say, "Sarah, we've discussed this. You're not lonely, you're bored because you don't have a hobby." He wasn't listening to her experience, he was editing it. He was rewriting her internal emotional state in real time to fit his narrative. It is what we call gaslighting, but it was a sophisticated form of it. It wasn't just "you're crazy," it was "you're incorrect." He was invalidating her humanity with logic. I turned to Sarah and asked her to tell me about the beginning. I wanted to know how they got here, because nobody walks down the aisle thinking they're going to end up in a war zone. She took a deep breath, and her voice was shaking, but she started to paint a picture that was very different from the spreadsheet Mark had provided. She told me about a man who, in the beginning, was her knight in shining armor. He was decisive. He took charge. When you are young and maybe a little unsure of yourself, which Sarah admitted she was, having someone step in and say, "I got this," feels like safety. It feels like love. She said he organized her life, paid off her student loans, and told her she didn't have to worry about the hard stuff anymore. But there is a very fine line between being taken care of and being controlled. It is a slow fade. It happens by degrees. First, he handles the bills. Then he suggests you don't really need that job because his career is taking off. Then he suggests that your friends are a bad influence. Then he suggests that your family is too intrusive. And before you know it, you are living on an island, and the only boat leaving that island is captained by the person who put you there. Sarah looked at me with tears streaming down her face and said, "I don't even know who I am anymore. I look in the mirror and I see a ghost. I wait for him to come home so I can ask him how my day was." That statement hit me hard. It was profound in its sadness. She had outsourced her own perception of reality to him. She needed him to validate her day before she could decide if it was good or bad. And Mark, he sat there checking his watch. He actually checked his watch while his wife was pouring her heart out to millions of people. That gesture told me more than 1,000 hours of therapy ever could. It told me that he viewed her pain as a waste of his time. It told me that he viewed empathy as an inefficiency. I looked at him and said, "Mark, do you hear what she is saying? Do you hear the pain in her voice?" And he looked back at me completely unruffled and said, "I hear her being dramatic, Dr. Phil. I hear her engaging in hyperbole. I provide a beautiful home. I provide financial security. I am faithful. I don't drink. I don't hit her. I have checked every box of being a good husband. If she is unhappy, that is a biochemical issue, not a marital one." That was the moment I knew we were in for a long day. He was hiding behind the checklist. He thought that if he did the technical requirements of a husband providing, protecting, remaining faithful, that he was exempt from the emotional requirements of a husband connecting, nurturing, understanding. He was operating under a contract that he had written that she had never signed, and he was holding her in breach of it every single day. I leaned forward in my chair. I rested my elbows on my knees, and I looked him dead in the eye. I said, "Mark, you seem to think that being right is the same thing as being happy. You seem to think that if you can win the debate, you win the marriage. But I've got news for you. You can be right, dead right, and you'll still be divorced. You'll be the most correct, lonely man in America." He didn't flinch. He just smiled, that tight, patronizing smile, and said, "I'm not afraid of being alone, Dr. Phil. I'm afraid of living in chaos." And frankly, Sarah is chaos. I'm just trying to bring some order to the situation, I knew then that I had to peel back the layers. I had to find out where this rigidity came from. People aren't born this way. You don't come out of the womb with a spreadsheet and a gavel. Something happens to make a man decide that emotions are dangerous and that control is the only safety. I needed to go back to his beginning. I needed to understand the architecture of his personality before I could even hope to do a renovation. So I asked him about his father. And for the first time since he walked onto that stage, the mask slipped, just a fraction. A little twitch under the left eye, a slight stiffening of the jaw. I had found the crack in the armor, and as any good investigator knows, once you find the crack, you don't look away. You grab a crowbar and you start prying. I asked Mark about his father, and the temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. He shifted in his seat, straightened his tie, a nervous tic that betrayed his composure, and told me that his father was a man of principle. He said his father was a military officer who ran his platoon and his household with the same rigorous discipline. Mark described a childhood that wasn't about play or exploration, but about performance. If he brought home an A-, his father didn't ask what happened. He asked if Mark was satisfied with being mediocre. If Mark scraped his knee, he was told to walk it off because pain was a signal of weakness and weakness was unacceptable. As he spoke, I saw the little boy inside the suit. I saw a child who learned very early on that love was not a gift you were given, but a salary you earned. He learned that emotions were messy variables that ruined the equation of a successful life. So he did what any smart kid in that environment would do. He shut them down. He amputated his own vulnerability to survive. He became a machine because machines don't get hurt and machines don't disappoint their fathers. But here is the tragedy of that survival strategy. The armor that protects you as a child becomes the prison that suffocates you as an adult. Mark had spent 30 years perfecting this persona of the unshakable man, and now he was using it to crush his wife. I looked over at Sarah, and I asked her about her background. I needed to know why she picked him. We don't choose partners by accident. We choose people who feel familiar, people who allow us to reenact the dramas of our childhood in hopes that this time we might get a different ending. Sarah told me she grew up in chaos. Her mother was an alcoholic, a woman who was the life of the party one minute and a weeping, destructive tornado the next. Sarah's childhood was unpredictable. She never knew which version of her mother was walking through the door. So when she met Mark, she didn't see a controlling robot. She saw a rock. She saw stability. She saw a man who had a plan, a man who paid bills on time, a man who never raised his voice. She was starving for order, and he was serving it up on a silver platter. It was the perfect storm. They were two puzzle pieces with jagged edges that fit together flawlessly. He needed someone to control to feel safe. She needed someone to control her to feel safe. For the first 2 years, it worked. They were in a dance that satisfied both of their neuroses. But the problem with people is that we grow, we evolve. Sarah started to heal. She started to want more than just safety. She wanted connection. She wanted intimacy. She wanted to be seen, not just managed. And the moment she tried to change the steps of the dance, Mark stepped on her toes. He didn't know how to partner with an equal. He only knew how to command a subordinate. When Sarah started voicing her opinions, Mark didn't see it as growth. He saw it as a rebellion. He saw it as a threat to the system he had built. That is when the escalation began. It wasn't an explosion, it was an erosion. Sarah told me about the first time she really felt the cage door slam shut. She had wanted to go back to school to finish her nursing degree. She was excited about it. She brought the brochures home, laid them out on the kitchen table, and waited for Mark to be proud of her. Instead, Mark picked up a calculator. He sat there for 10 minutes, punching in numbers, not saying a word, while Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. Finally, he looked up and said, "It's not a viable investment, Sarah. The tuition cost versus your projected entry-level salary don't yield a positive ROI for 7 years. We're not doing it just like that. No discussion, no negotiation, no acknowledgement of her dreams. He vetoed her future like he was declining a budget request for office supplies." Sarah told me she cried for 3 days. And do you know what Mark did? He bought her a treadmill. He told her that if she had so much nervous energy, she should burn it off instead of moping around the house. That level of disconnect is breathtaking. It is psychological violence wrapped in the guise of logical advice. Over the years, the incidents piled up. When Sarah's mother passed away, Mark gave her exactly 3 days to grieve before he told her it was time to snap out of it and get the house back in order because the laundry was piling up. He wasn't trying to be cruel. In his mind, he was being efficient. He thought grief was a waste of productivity. He couldn't understand that you can't schedule heartbreak. The tension in their house became a physical thing. Sarah described walking on eggshells, but it was worse than that. It was like living in a courtroom where you are always on trial and the judge is your husband. She started hiding things, small things. She would buy a coffee and hide the receipt because Mark would audit the bank statements and ask why she needed a $5 latte when they had a coffee maker at home. She stopped calling her friends because Mark would stand in the doorway listening and later critique her conversations, telling her she sounded unintelligent or gossipy. He was systematically isolating her, cutting off her lifelines until he was the only source of feedback she had. And because he was so calm, so rational, so right on paper, she started to believe him. She started to believe she was the defective one. Things came to a head about 6 months before they called my producers. Sarah had a health scare. She found a lump. She was terrified. She called Mark at work, sobbing, needing her husband to tell her it was going to be okay. Mark told her he was in a meeting and would discuss it when he got home. When he finally walked through the door at 7 p.m., he didn't hug her. He didn't ask how she felt. He handed her a printout of insurance copays and a list of approved doctors that were in network. He had spent the afternoon researching the financial implications of her potential cancer, but he hadn't spent 1 second thinking about the emotional devastation of his wife. Sarah told me that was the moment something inside her broke. She looked at this man who was supposed to be her partner in life, and she realized she was entirely alone. She realized that if she died, he would probably grieve for a week and then start interviewing replacements based on a set of criteria he kept in a file folder. But Mark saw this differently. When I asked him about that night, he looked genuinely confused. He said, "Dr. Phil, I took immediate action. I ensured she had the best medical care within our budget. I removed the stress of the logistics so she could focus on healing. Why is that villainous? I solved the problem." And that right there is the crux of the issue. Mark thinks intimacy is project management. He thinks love is a series of transactions. He doesn't understand that sometimes you don't need a solution. Sometimes you just need to be held. You need someone to say, "I'm scared too, but I'm here." Mark is incapable of that because to admit fear is to violate the prime directive his father installed in him 30 years ago. The fight that finally got them onto my stage happened a week ago. Sarah had threatened to leave. She had packed a bag, just a small overnight bag, and set it by the door. It was a bluff, mostly. A cry for help. She wanted him to stop her. She wanted him to panic, to show some emotion, to fight for her. Mark came home, saw the bag, saw her standing there with her coat on, and he didn't yell, he didn't beg. He walked past her, went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and said, "If you leave, I will freeze the joint accounts by morning. You have no credit history of your own. You have no income. You'll be back in 3 days, and we'll have wasted time and money. So why don't you just take your coat off and go start dinner?" He called her bluff with a nuclear threat delivered in a monotone voice. He stripped her of her dignity in under 30 seconds. And Sarah took off her coat. She unpacked the bag. She started dinner. But that night, she wrote to my show, she realized she was a hostage. And Mark agreed to come because he truly, honestly believed that I would look at that situation and tell him, "Good job, Mark. You prevented a reckless decision with sound logic." He brought her here to be fixed, not realizing that he was the one who was broken. He was so arrogant in his dysfunction that he thought he could outsmart the process. He thought he could sit in that chair and intellectualize his way out of the fact that he was emotionally abusing his wife. I looked at the audience, and the room was dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. They were horrified. They were looking at Mark like he was a monster. But I didn't see a monster. I saw a tragedy. I saw a man who had been so thoroughly conditioned to reject his own humanity that he was incapable of recognizing it in anyone else. But I also knew that if I didn't break through that shell today, right now, Sarah was going to wither away until there was nothing left of her. I had to hit him hard. I had to use his own logic against him. I had to show him that his perfect system was failing and that the biggest liability in his life wasn't his wife's emotions, it was his own emotional illiteracy. I took a deep breath, adjusted my cuffs, and prepared to dismantle the fortress Mark had spent a lifetime building. We were at a tipping point. The audience was practically vibrating with frustration. Mark was sitting there, calm as a cucumber, convinced he was the most rational person in the room. Sarah was shrinking into herself, a ghost of a woman who had been told for too long that her feelings were inconvenient. I knew I couldn't just tell Mark he was wrong. He would deflect that. He would see it as an emotional argument, and in his world, emotions are irrelevant. I had to speak his language. I had to use logic. I had to show him that his system was producing a catastrophic failure rate. I leaned forward and looked at him. "Mark," I said, "let's talk about results. You're a results-oriented guy, right? You care about the bottom line." "Absolutely," he said, nodding. "That's how you measure success." "Okay," I said. "Then let's look at the data. You have a wife who is clinically depressed. You have a marriage that is on life support. You have zero intimacy. You have a home environment that is filled with tension and resentment. If this were a business, Mark, you would be bankrupt. You would be fired by the board of directors for gross incompetence." For the first time, he blinked. He actually paused. I had framed his failure not as a moral one, but as a functional one. "But Dr. Phil," he stammered, "the financials are sound. The house is paid for. We have retirement savings. The operational side is perfect." "The operational side is irrelevant if the product is defective," I shot back. "You are manufacturing misery, Mark. You are the CEO of a misery factory. And you are sitting here telling me how great the factory floor looks while the product is toxic sludge." The audience gasped. A few people started clapping, but I held up a hand. I wasn't doing this for applause. I was doing this to crack the shell. "You say you want peace," I continued. "You say you want order, but you are creating chaos. You are driving your wife to the brink of a nervous breakdown. Do you think a breakdown is efficient? Do you think a divorce is cost-effective? Do you think living alone in a big, empty house with your spreadsheets is a victory?" He looked down at his hands. I don't want a divorce. he said quietly. It would be messy. It would be devastating, I corrected him. Not just financially, but emotionally. And you know why? Because deep down, under all that armor, under all those layers of logic your father drilled into you, there is a scared little boy who is terrified of being abandoned. You control her because you are afraid if you let go, she will leave. You don't trust that you are lovable enough to keep her without the cage. Mark's head snapped up. His eyes were wide. I had hit a nerve. I had named the fear. I am not afraid, he said, but his voice lacked the usual steel. It was thinner. I want things done right. And who defined right for you? I asked softly. Was it you? Or was it a man who died 10 years ago? A man who never hugged you? A man who taught you that love is weakness? Mark went silent. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her, for the first time all day. She was weeping silently, tears tracking through her makeup. Sarah, I said, turning to her, I want you to do something for me. I want you to look at your husband and tell him what you need, not what you think he wants to hear, not what is logical. Tell him what is in your heart right now. Sarah took a shaky breath. She looked at Mark, her hands trembling in her lap. Mark, she whispered, I don't need a manager. I need a husband. I need to know that if I fall apart, you won't just stand there and analyze the pieces. I need you to hold me. I need you to tell me that I matter more than the bank account. I am lonely, Mark. I am so incredibly lonely in this marriage. The silence stretched out. It was agonizing. Mark was wrestling with 30 years of programming. You could see the internal struggle on his face. The old software was saying, shut it down, correct her, show her the data, but something new, something raw was trying to break through. Finally, he spoke. I don't know how to do that, Sarah, he admitted, his voice cracked. I don't know how to fix it without a plan. That is the point, Mark. I said, my voice firm but compassionate. Love isn't a plan, it's a risk. It's messy, it's unpredictable, and it is the only thing that makes this life worth living. You have spent your whole life avoiding the mess, and you have ended up with nothing real. I stood up and walked over to him. I put a hand on his shoulder. You are at a crossroads, son. You can keep your pride, you can keep your spreadsheets, and you can lose your wife. Or you can admit that you don't know everything. You can admit that you are scared. You can admit that you need help. Mark looked up at me, and his eyes were wet. I don't want to lose her, he whispered, but I don't know how to change. I've been this way forever. You haven't been this way forever, I said. You learned this, and what is learned can be unlearned. But you have to be willing to do the work. And let me tell you, it is harder than any business deal you have ever closed. It requires you to be vulnerable. It requires you to be wrong. It requires you to listen. I turned back to the audience. We are going to take a break, but when we come back, I am going to give Mark and Sarah a choice, a real choice, because this isn't just about saving a marriage. This is about saving 2 lives from a prison of their own making. During the break, the producers were buzzing. They knew we had something real. Mark was backstage, pacing. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't reading a file. He was just pacing, running his hands through his hair. Sarah was sitting with one of my counselors, getting a tissue, drinking some water. She looked exhausted, but there was a spark in her eye that hadn't been there before. She had spoken her truth, and the sky hadn't fallen. That is a powerful realization. When we came back, the energy was different. It was less hostile, more fragile. Mark sat down, but he didn't cross his legs. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looking at Sarah. "Mark," I said, "I have a question for you, and I want you to answer honestly. If you continue on this path exactly as you are today, where will you be in 5 years?" He looked at the floor. "Alone," he said, "or miserable." "And Sarah," I asked, "where will you be?" "I don't think I'll be here," she said quietly. I think I would fade away completely." "That is the reality," I said. "That is the data. So the question is, are you ready to rewrite the program? Are you ready to fire the old CEO and hire a new one that leads with the heart, not just the head?" Mark nodded slowly. "I am," he said, "but I need help. I don't know the first step." "The first step," I said, "is an apology. A real one. Not 'I'm sorry you feel that way,' but 'I am sorry I hurt you.' Can you do that?" Mark turned to Sarah. He took her hands. They were cold, but he held them tight. "Sarah," he said, his voice trembling, "I am sorry. I thought I was protecting us. I thought I was doing the right thing. But I see now that I was just controlling you because I was scared. I am so sorry for making you feel small. I am sorry for making you feel alone." Sarah started to cry again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the hopeless sobbing of a trapped animal, it was relief. It was the release of years of pent-up pain. Mark hesitated for a second, the old habit of freezing up, but then he did something that shocked everyone. He leaned in and hugged her. Awkwardly at first, stiffly, but then he buried his face in her neck and just held on. He held on like a man who was drowning and had finally found a raft. The audience was silent. No applause, just a collective exhale. We were witnessing a thaw. We were watching a glacier melt in real time. That, I said softly, is a start. That is a connection. You didn't solve a problem, Mark. You connected with a person. Do you feel the difference? He pulled back, wiping his eyes, looking a little embarrassed, but also lighter. "Yeah," he said, "it feels scary, but better." "It is better," I said, "because it is real." Now, I am not naive. I know that one hug doesn't fix 30 years of dysfunction. Mark has a lifetime of rewiring to do. He has to learn that emotions are not enemies. He has to learn to validate Sarah without solving her. He has to learn to sit in the discomfort of feelings without reaching for a calculator. And Sarah has work to do too. She has to learn to stand her ground. She has to learn to trust her own voice again. She has to stop asking for permission to exist. "I have a plan for you," I told them. "But it is not the kind of plan you are used to, Mark. There are no spreadsheets. There are no quarterly reviews. I am sending you to a treatment center that specializes in emotional intelligence and trauma recovery. You are going to go there together and individually. You are going to dig up the roots of that control, Mark, and you are going to burn them. And Sarah, you are going to find your voice loud and clear. And when you come back, we are going to see if you can build a partnership instead of a dictatorship." Mark nodded. "I'll do it," he said. "Whatever it takes." "Good," I said, "because the alternative is unacceptable." Now, a lot of folks sitting at home watch a moment like that, the tears, the hug, the apology, and they think, well, there it is, problem solved. They wrap it up in a neat little bow, change the channel, and figure the couple is going to ride off into the sunset. But if you have spent more than 5 minutes working in human behavior, you know that a breakthrough on a television stage is not the finish line. It is barely the starting gun. That moment of clarity is a beautiful thing, but it is fragile. It is like striking a match in a windstorm. If you do not cup your hands around that flame and feed it some real fuel, it is going to blow out before you even take your next breath. I knew that sending Mark and Sarah out the studio doors with nothing but a good cry and a solid handshake was a recipe for a relapse. Mark's control issues were deeply entrenched survival mechanisms, and Sarah's submission was a trauma response. You do not cure that with a pep talk. That is why I sent them to one of the most intensive psychological retreat centers in the country. This wasn't a spa. There were no massages and cucumber water. This was roll up your sleeves, look in the mirror, ugly cry kind of work. It was a dual-track program where they would be stripped down to their absolute emotional studs, both individually and as a couple. And I kept tabs on them. I talked to their lead therapist, Dr. Hayes, every single week because I wanted to know exactly how Mark was handling an environment where he was not the smartest guy in the room and he was not in charge of the schedule. Predictably, the first 2 weeks were a disaster. When Mark arrived at the facility, he actually asked the intake coordinator for a syllabus. He wanted a rubric. He wanted to know exactly what the success metrics were for each day of therapy so he could optimize his time. When Dr. Hayes told him that the goal for the day was simply to sit with his discomfort, Mark almost packed his bags. He tried to intellectualize everything. When they asked him about his father's emotional absence, Mark would give them a sociological breakdown of post-war parenting paradigms. He was using his massive intellect as a shield, deflecting every probe into his heart by turning it into an academic debate. He was trying to win therapy. He thought if he could just understand the psychology of his trauma on a cognitive level, he would be cured. But you cannot think your way out of a feeling problem. You have to feel your way out of it. I remember Dr. Hayes telling me about a breakthrough they finally had in week 3. They put Mark in a room with a group of other men who were dealing with similar issues of control and emotional detachment. Mark tried to take over the group, of course. He started offering the other men unsolicited advice on how to structure their mornings to avoid conflict with their wives. And one of the men, a guy who had just lost his marriage because of his own rigidity, looked at Mark and said, "Buddy, your schedule is exactly why your wife is miserable. You are treating her like an employee and you're a terrible boss." Mark was furious. His initial reaction was to attack the man's logic, to point out the flaws in his argument, but the facilitators stopped him. They forced Mark to close his mouth and just notice what was happening in his body. For 20 minutes, Mark had to sit in a chair, completely silent, while his heart raced and his face flushed. He later admitted that it was the most terrifying 20 minutes of his life, because for the first time since he was a little boy, he was experiencing pure, unadulterated vulnerability without a spreadsheet to hide behind. He realized he was profoundly angry, and underneath that anger, he was terrified. Meanwhile, Sarah was fighting a completely different battle on the other side of the campus. If Mark's challenge was learning to let go of the steering wheel, Sarah's challenge was learning how to drive. When she first got to the retreat, she was completely paralyzed by the lack of direction. If they told her she had 2 hours of free time, she would freeze. She would literally sit in her room waiting for someone to tell her what to do. She had spent a decade outsourcing her autonomy to Mark, and without him there to audit her choices, the sheer volume of freedom was panic-inducing. Her therapist had to start with the most basic building blocks of self-determination. They would ask her, "What do you want for lunch?" And she would say, "Whatever everyone else is having, They would not let her eat until she picked a specific meal. It sounds rudimentary, but for a woman who had been systematically conditioned to believe her preferences were a burden, choosing a turkey sandwich over a salad was a monumental act of rebellion. The turning point for Sarah came during an equine therapy session. They put her in a round pen with a 1,000-pound horse and told her she had to get the horse to walk in a circle without using a lead rope, just by using her body language and her energy. At first, Sarah tried to make herself small. She tiptoed around the dirt, whispering to the horse, apologizing for being in its way. The horse completely ignored her. It just stood in the center of the pen and ate grass. The therapist told Sarah that the horse was treating her exactly the way Mark did because she was projecting the exact same energy, "I do not matter, please do not be mad at me." If she wanted the horse to move, she had to claim her space. She had to believe she had the right to direct the situation. Sarah spent an hour in that dirt pen crying, frustrated, and feeling completely powerless. But then something snapped. She realized that nobody was going to rescue her. Mark wasn't there to calculate the geometry of the pen, and the therapist wasn't going to step in and do it for her. She had to find her own weight. She squared her shoulders, stepped directly into the horse's line of sight, pointed her finger, and said, "Walk." Her voice was loud. It echoed off the metal fencing. And the horse picked up its head, snorted, and started to walk the perimeter. Sarah collapsed in the dirt and sobbed, not from sadness, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that she existed. She had a voice, it had impact, and she did not need permission to use it. When they finally brought Mark and Sarah back together in week 4 for couples therapy, it was like introducing 2 entirely new people. The dynamic had completely shifted, and frankly, it was incredibly awkward at first. They had to do an exercise called emotional mirroring. Sarah had to share a painful memory from their marriage, and all Mark was allowed to do was repeat back what she said and validate her feeling. He was strictly forbidden from explaining, defending, or fixing. Sarah brought up the time he vetoed her nursing degree. She looked him in the eye and said, "When you did that, I felt completely worthless. I felt like a line item on a budget instead of your partner." I watched the tape of this session later, and you could physically see the agony on Mark's face. Every muscle in his jaw was twitching. His brain was screaming at him to explain the compound interest of the student loans, to justify his decision with math. You could see him physically biting his tongue. He took a deep, shuddering breath, looked at his wife, and said, "You felt worthless. You felt like I treated you like a line item instead of a partner." And it makes perfect sense that you would feel that way because my behavior was incredibly dismissive. He didn't make an excuse. He didn't pull out a calculator. He just met her in her pain. And Sarah, for the first time in 10 years, didn't back down. She didn't apologize for making him uncomfortable. She just nodded and let his validation land. It was clunky, it was mechanical, and it was the most beautiful thing I had seen in a long time. Because it was the first time they were communicating as equals, but a retreat is a controlled environment. It is a greenhouse where delicate things can grow without dealing with the frost. The real test was never going to be what they did in a circle of therapists in a quiet facility in the woods. The real test was going to be what happened when they went back to their house. What would happen when the mortgage was due, when the laundry piled up, when the daily grind of life started applying pressure to their new, fragile boundaries? I knew they were terrified to leave, so we brought them back to the studio for a follow-up, not to take a victory lap, but to look them in the eye and figure out if this profound transformation could survive the real world. We had to see if they could actually live it. When Mark and Sarah walked back onto my stage 6 months later, The energy was entirely different. 6 months prior, they had walked out here like a hostage and a warden. Sarah had been a ghost, and Mark had been a machine. Now, they walked out holding hands. And it wasn't that performative, tight-gripped hand-holding you see when people are trying to convince you they're okay. It was relaxed. It was loose. They sat down on the couch, and for the first time, Mark didn't immediately cross his legs and lean away from her. He sat closer. He looked softer. The sharp, rigid lines of his posture had blurred into something that looked a whole lot more like a human being. I looked at them, and I didn't smile right away. I don't give out gold stars for effort. I give them out for results. I wanted to know what happened when the cameras were off, when the therapist went home, and they were alone in that big house with all its old ghosts. So I said, leaning forward, resting my elbows on my knees, "You've been out of the greenhouse for 4 months. You're back in the real world. Mark, I want to know about the first fight you two had when you got home." Mark let out a breath that sounded half like a laugh and half like a sigh. He looked at Sarah, and she gave him a small, encouraging nod. The fact that he looked to her for a cue that he didn't just bulldoze into his answer told me volumes. "It was about a week after we got back," Mark said, his voice calmer, lacking that old condescending edge. "Sarah wanted to paint the guest room. She bought the paint, but it wasn't the brand I usually buy. It was more expensive, and the color, well, it wasn't practical. It was bright yellow." I raised an eyebrow. "And the old Mark would have done what?" "The old Mark," he said, shaking his head slowly, "would have returned the paint. I would have sat her down with a spreadsheet showing the cost difference, explained why yellow is a terrible color for resale value, and then I would have gone out and bought a neutral beige. I would have handled it. And I would have thought I was being helpful." "And what did the new Mark do?" I asked. He swallowed hard. You could tell this wasn't easy for him. He was still fighting 30 years of programming every single day. The new Mark walked into the kitchen, saw the paint cans, and felt my chest tighten. My brain started doing the math automatically, but I stopped. I remembered what Dr. Hayes said. I asked myself, is this a hill worth dying on? Is $100 worth my wife's happiness? Mark turned to look at Sarah. I walked into the guest room, and she was already taping the baseboards. I didn't say a word about the price. I just asked her if she needed a roller. And Dr. Phil, it killed me. It physically pained me not to correct her. But when she smiled at me, when she looked at me without that fear in her eyes, it was worth it. We painted the room yellow. It's objectively terrible, but she loves it. The audience let out a collective, warm laugh, but I stayed focused. That's a good start, Mark, but a paint color is low stakes. What happens when the stakes are high? What happens when she makes a decision that actually impacts your life, your routine, your security? Sarah spoke up then, and her voice, it was a revelation. It wasn't shaking. It wasn't a whisper. It was clear and grounded. "I enrolled in nursing school, Dr. Phil." I sat back in my chair. "You did?" "I did," she said, sitting up straighter. "I went down to the community college. I met with an advisor, and I registered for my prerequisites. I didn't ask Mark for permission. I didn't ask him to run the numbers. I just came home and told him it was happening." I looked at Mark. "And how did the CEO handle that hostile takeover?" Mark actually smiled. A genuine, self-deprecating smile. "I panicked," he admitted freely. "I absolutely panicked. I went into my office and I probably ran 5 different financial models trying to figure out how we were going to survive the tuition cost and the loss of her time around the house. I spun out for about 2 hours. But you didn't shut it down," I noted. "No." he said quietly. Because I realized that the spreadsheet didn't account for the cost of her soul. I realized that if I stopped her again, I would be choosing my comfort over her life. So I came out of the office, I told her I was scared, and I asked her how I could support her. That right there is the definition of a breakthrough. It isn't that the fear goes away. It isn't that Mark magically stopped caring about efficiency or finances. It is that he stopped letting those things dictate his humanity. He learned to put a gap between his anxiety and his reaction. He learned that his wife's autonomy was more important than his need for control. Sarah, I said, turning to her, how does it feel to live in that house now? She looked down at her hands, then back up at me, and her eyes were shining. It feels like a home, Dr. Phil. For the first time, it feels like we are partners. He still gets tense. He still tries to organize my closet sometimes when he's stressed. But when I tell him to stop, he stops. He listens to me. I don't feel like a ghost anymore. I feel like I exist. I looked at the two of them sitting there on my stage, fighting for a marriage that most people would have written off as a total loss. They weren't perfect. Mark was going to have to manage his control issues for the rest of his life, like a chronic condition. Sarah was going to have to keep practicing her assertiveness, making sure she never slipped back into that comfortable, silent compliance. But they were doing the work. They had stopped fighting each other and started fighting the dysfunction. Listen to me, I said, my voice dropping an octave, dead serious. What you two have done is incredibly rare. Most people would rather be right than be happy. Most people will ride their ego right off a cliff and blame gravity on the way down. You, Mark, you stepped back from the cliff, you put down the gavel, and you picked up a mirror. And Sarah, you stopped waiting for someone to give you a life, and you went out and claimed it. I leaned in, making sure they heard every word. You have a long road ahead of you. The old habits are going to try and creep back in when you're tired, when you're stressed, when life throws you a curveball. But you have the tools now. You know what the trap looks like, so you don't have to step in it. You keep communicating. You keep validating. And Mark, you keep remembering that the most valuable assets you have in this world cannot be quantified on a balance sheet. Mark nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears, and he squeezed Sarah's hand. I know, Dr. Phil, I finally know. I wrapped up the show, the audience applauded, and as I watched them walk off the stage together, I felt that familiar, quiet satisfaction that keeps me doing this job year after year. They weren't just a success story, they were a testament to the fact that no matter how deep the rut, no matter how rigid the armor, people can change. You just have to be willing to tell the truth, face the pain, and do the work.